We were a mess. We just could not break through the fact that we had had a horrible marriage for the first 16 years. I grew up in a Christian home, and we went to church every Sunday morning and Sunday evening and every Wednesday night, and that was what we did.
Well, I met my husband right after high school. I just thought that he loved me and I loved him, and everything would be okay. But from the very beginning, though, it was not.
We dated for about 8 months, and we got married, and unfortunately, that lifestyle that I developed starting back in high school of drinking and drugs and an immoral lifestyle, that continued on into our marriage, and it lasted for the first 16 years.
Even though our marriage was very dysfunctional, during those years, God brought me to a saving knowledge of Himself. So it was just a process of many years to, from that point then on, to bring Jim to the Lord. And by the time he had done that, though, there had been a lot of damage in our marriage.
I knew what I was doing was wrong and wasn't very honoring to the Lord, and I didn't even have to have a relationship with Him to know that. I came in one evening, and my wife, Connie, confronted me about what was going on in my life. So I shared with Connie how I'd been unfaithful to her for the first 16 years of our marriage.
And I thought, you know, what have I been even doing here in this marriage? So I was completely devastated, and as a result, I filed for divorce.
After Connie filed a divorce, it really devastated me. I was really losing everything. I had a beautiful wife, 3 beautiful daughters, and beautiful home, wonderful job, and God was really getting my attention. I never will forget, in East Tennessee, where we live, there's a lot of old country roads, and I came around a curve there that evening and looked over in this field, and there was a barn, and that barn was collapsing. I don't know if it had been hit by lightning or if it was just old, but it was a picture of my life. It was falling apart. And Jesus said, "That's you, Jim. You need me." And that's when I surrendered my life to Him.
I was 19 years into my marriage at this point, and still was, it was a very terrible situation. I knew that God didn't want me to divorce. I knew His perfect will for me was to reconcile, but yet I couldn't find that forgiveness in my heart, even though I was trying so hard.
She called me up. We were separated, and she called me up and she said, "Jim," said, "I'm not going to divorce you, and you can come back home, but I'm not going to keep my rings on. We'll be here in this home together." And I was thrilled to death just to get a second chance to be able to try to right what was wrong for those first 16 years of our marriage. We were a mess. We just could not break through the fact that we had had a horrible marriage for the first 16 years. So that's where God found us when Life Action came to our church. It was like God was using this ministry to help restore our marriage. Each message that they gave, whether it was on pride or a clear conscience or grace, it was just a building block to help put our marriage back together.
During the summit, one of the messages that God spoke to me the most in was the grace message about how I needed God's power and desire to do His will. And at that point, prior to that, I had not wanted to do His will because I was so angry. And He showed me through these messages the pride that was in my heart. So just through confession of my sins, as He showed me and revealed that to my heart, the truth about my heart, confessing before Him, and He just poured His forgiveness and His grace in me and gave me then the power to do His will, and that was to reconcile with my husband.
One of the neat things that happened that very first day that they were there, they had prayer cards for us to fill out if we had a prayer request, where our 11-year-old daughter filled out one of those prayer cards, and her prayer was, "Please let my mom and dad put their rings back on." And we had no idea that she'd even noticed we had our rings off. The one night that I had to be out of town, I called Connie when I got in. She answered the phone, and our daughter was sitting on the bed with her. So I asked her, I said, well, how did it go tonight? And she said, Jim, it went great. And I said, well, what was the message about? And she said, well, they talked about God's grace. And the definition of God's grace that they used was the power and desire to do His will and not your own. And she said to me, Jim, I don't have the power and the desire to love you, but through God's grace I do. So as a result of that, I'm putting my rings back on tonight. And you can imagine the impact that that had on that little 11-year-old girl. God answered her prayer. So as a result of Connie putting her rings back on, when I got home from my business trip, I put my rings back on.
Toward the end of the summit, they had all the couples stand up, the married couples stand up and exchange their vows. And Jim and I were able to actually do that during the summit, and we felt like that was the time that we really could look eye to eye and soul to soul and spirit to spirit, and we gave our lives back to the Lord and our marriage to the Lord, and really began the reconciliation process. We are so grateful in what God has done through the ministry of Life Action. When we stop and think back over 20 some years ago at what He's done, we just stand amazed, and we are so grateful that He brought Life Action into our lives and used them as a tool.
Our marriage, we fully give God credit for putting that back together. And it's because Connie had a personal relationship with Jesus, and I have a personal relationship with Jesus. And He became the head of our home, and it's all because of Him. It's not about us. So we give Him glory.